Good morning, everyone. I'm a little sick, so I've been kind of hiding out. I don't want to get anybody infected. I took a COVID test this morning. No COVID, at least that's what the test says. So just probably upper respiratory stuff. I think about half of you have the same thing, just listen to everybody. But I am glad to be here today and excited. And I had a message on my heart that I wanted to bring to conclude this service. And so, our governing board's pretty awesome. They're like, you could stay home. We'll just, I don't know what you guys would do, but it would be good. And I was like, well, I'm halfway there. So, we're going to do this. We have a congregational meeting after church as well, and I'm going to stay for that, and I have some things I want to share with you, but keep your distance, and all that. So we are in the final week of a sermon series titled Created for Connection, and this series is based off of a book by the same title called Created for Connection by Dr. Sue Johnson. She's a practicing psychologist, and she uses the theory called attachment theory in her practice, and that's what she features in the book. And we've been talking about that for the past few weeks. And one of the things I love about this book and I love about this series and why I was so excited to share it with you is that this series, it takes psychology and theology, and it talks about the place where they overlap. And the place where they both overlap from an attachment theory, the psychological theory, and then from the basic theology. I mean, we've talked about this the past few weeks, page 1 theology, where God says, let us. God is, from a Christian perspective, not just an individual person, but a trinity, three persons or three distinct persons, but one God. And so right there at the first page of the Bible is this idea that the basis of all life is a connection. And so from a psychological point of view and from a theological point of view, you are created for a connection because you're created in the image of God, and God is ultimately a connection at its fundamental basis. And you know what else is cool? What else, Pastor Scott? Your biology says the same thing about you as well. In fact, we've made the claim, all the ologies in a certain sort of way, they make this claim that we're created for connection. And so I want to share with you something about your biology that I learned this past week, and I think it's kind of neat. I'm going to take you back to the summer of 1992, the University of Parma, which is just outside of the Italian city of Milan. And there's some scientists that I believe, this is just based on the evidence of the time. It's not conclusive, but I believe that they're wearing backwards clothes. And you know why they're wearing backwards clothes? Harry, you know why they're wearing backwards clothes. Because in 1992, Jump by Criss Cross was the hot hit, and everybody was adopting backwards clothes. So here's the scientist, and he's jamming out to Jump by Criss Cross, and he's got a monkey who's got like a little cap on, and he's hooked to a computer, and you see the Italian flag. I put a lot of love into that slide for you guys this week, a lot of detail. And he's running this, experiment on the monkey's brain, and then he takes a break. And the Italian scientist, who I think probably more than likely is wearing backwards clothes, he does what any good scientist does on his break. He eats ice cream. How'd you know? You know this. Oh my, David Milsheimer, everybody. This guy reads weird stuff. Okay. Yeah, he has some ice cream. And I guess he fails to unhook the monkey because the monkey's brain is flashing while he's watching the scientists eat the ice cream. And so then they run some experiments and they observe what the monkey does when the monkey gets to eat ice cream. And they found this idea of mirror neurons. And mirror neurons, according to the journal of Natural Science, fire in the same way when we actually recreate that action in ourselves. So the brain activity in the monkey is the same when he's watching the scientists eat the ice cream as when he's actually eating the ice cream, which is no surprise to any of you that have a dog. Clover could literally taste the cookies that I was eating in the car while, she was watching. So let me ask you a question. Who here has ever cried at a movie? Raise your hand. Yeah. How about shouted for joy or frustration, Bears fans, Colts fans, at a football game, Or have you ever rocked out at a concert, Yeah. This is what we call resonance. You resonate with that movie, with the plot line and the actors, or you resonate with the touchdown or the touchdown, oh man, they let another touchdown, or you resonate with the music. And physicists, they speak of resonance as a sympathetic vibration between two elements that allow them to suddenly synchronize signals and act in a new harmony. There's a biological, there's a physical reality to this connection when you're rocking out to a song, when you're crying at a movie, when you are cheering for your favorite team. The Apostle Paul, he writes many of the documents that make up our New Testament. In Romans chapter 12, he says this: don't pretend just to love others. Really love them. Well, how do we do that, the Apostle Paul? Well, I'm going to tell you. First of all, you want to love each other with genuine affection. Don't do it from arm's distance. I mean, affection, like up close and, with feeling. Take delight in honoring each other. Isn't that a great concept? When your spouse, your friend has something good going on and you're like, let me tell you about my wife. She's the best cook you'd ever meet, and people are, and I just take honor and delight in her. You take honor and delight in your good friend, like, let me tell you about David. He reads widely. He knows about all the things. You take honor. That's how you really love. Like, actually have delight in honoring other people. That's what it means to love. He says, be happy with those who are happy and weep with those who are weep. Live in harmony with each other. In other words, what the Apostle Paul is saying is you need to resonate with your mate. Resonate with your mate. Now, at the front of your brain, this is not scientific where these things are on the brain. This is like a clip art thing. But at the front of your brain, this is a scientific reality. It's your prefrontal cortex. And so I want all of you just right here, just go ahead and touch the prefrontal cortex and then say, cortex. I knew Larson would love that. That was for you, buddy. Yeah. Cortex, yeah. It's in your prefrontal cortex that those mirror neurons are that allow you to resonate with your mate, that allow you to resonate with that music, to resonate with that football team, whatever. You have another part of your brain called the amygdala. And when you experience a threat, and so maybe that's like a Italian scientist with his hair on fire, or maybe it's just like your spouse who's showing up and they're angry and you did something wrong or did something to offend them, and so they're coming at you and they want to tell you what for. And when that happens, we know from neuroscience that you experience something called amygdala hijack. Your amygdala, it hijacks your brain and it takes over, and the prefrontal cortex, the executive functioning of your brain where you can look at the world with complexity and nuance, including the mirror neurons where you can actually feel the other emotions of other people and resonate with them. All that is canceled out, and your amygdala has hijacked your brain function, and you fall into a fight or flight response. Some of you know this already, right? And this fight and flight response, it can be a lifesaver, because if, this angry spouse or this scientist with his hair on fire, whatever that is over there, if that person's showing up with a knife trying to do you wrong, your amygdala will actually reroute the blood in your body, and it'll go down in your legs, and you'll have that flight response, and your ability to run will be better, and you can get away. Right, this is life-saving. It's a reaction. You're not thinking about it. It's immediate. You all understand that, right? But if it's actually just your spouse and, they're not trying to kill you, they just need to bring up something that you did that was insensitive, and instead of a knife, they're eating an ice cream cone, your amygdala doesn't know the difference, and you still fall into that fight or flight response. And for those of you that were here last week, it is from this place in the amygdala hijack that we fall into the 3 demon dialogues that destroy relationships. And if you missed last week, I really encourage you to go back and watch last week's message. It's on YouTube. Not because I preached well, it's because the content from this book, Created for Connection, is just really good. You'll identify yourself and the patterns you fall into. And several of you have reached out in the past week just to tell me that, that was helpful. Because the whole idea, and this was the application of last week, and just to remind you, that when we begin to understand these demon dialogues, find the bad guy, you all know what that is. It's, you did it. No, you did it. Anybody ever done this before? You all have done this before, right? You know, or the protest polka, the flee and chase, that sort of thing. Last week's application was simply to identify the pattern and not the person as the problem. And couples that are able to keep that connection, you're created for that connection, but there's this force from a Christian's perspective, the spiritual reality, that is trying to break that connection. And so you need to identify that pattern, not the person as a problem. And you want to stand by the side of your friend or your spouse and work against the pattern, not against the person. And Jesus says, you know, the truth will set you free. And I think you can take this text out of context and use it for all sorts of things, but I think it applies here. That if you understand the truth about how we fall into these predictable patterns, it's not just you and your spouse, not just you and your friend. If you can understand how we all fall into this and learn to stand against the pattern, not the person, it will begin to free you from falling into these destructive patterns. To put it another way, recognizing the emotional response, right? This amygdala hijack and this response that we fall into, it allows you then to choose to pursue emotional connection. And that connection that we're all created for, we need to pursue it. It comes naturally when you're first dating. Oh, he's so handsome. Oh, she's so beautiful. You're just connected. You know, you're falling in love. That's great. But after a while, you know, you got to do what once came naturally, intentionally, and you got to pursue this emotional connection. Let me tell you about your heart. There's two sides of your heart. This is not scientific. Okay, I mean, your heart has chambers and stuff, but, you know. But you get what I'm saying. There's two sides of your heart. One side, there's a longing for connection because God created you for connection. But on the other side of your heart, there's a fear of rejection. You're afraid that you might be rejected. And love, you know, it requires vulnerability. It requires you opening up. But vulnerability surrenders safety. This is why it can be so hard to be in a connected, loving relationship. Because you're literally opening yourself up and surrendering that safety. I want to tell you about Charlie and Kyoko. These are two people that Dr. Sue Johnson, she does a verbatim case study of them in her book. And I just want to pause for a moment and just note that this is a heterosexual couple. And here at Faith, we fully affirm same-sex couples. And we have plenty of couples like that here. And, you know, I was talking to Father Ryan, who he's married to Barry, and in a same-sex relationship. We were talking through just the content of this, and it applies to his relationship just like it applies to my relationship, what have you. And so just noting that and to say, I think these principles are universal, although she does talk about men in a heterosexual relationship, men tend to fulfill one role, not always, and women tend to fill others, and I'm not sure exactly how that plays out for same-sex relationships. But we learned a little bit about Charlie. Charlie, he has a tendency when conflict arises to become emotionally removed and fall into logical lectures. How many of you are, no, I'm just kidding, I won't ask you, you know. Yeah, it's me, I'm definitely one of those. I'm the one, I want to get out the whiteboard, you know, remember that from last week, and be like, point A, point B, point C, why don't you love me more after I just proved I was right, you know? You know, so this is Charlie, right? He's emotionally removed when there's conflict. He becomes cold, and he's got this logical lectures, and he's a engineer, I think, is what his profession is. And Kyoko, she's prone to angry tirades, and then teary hopelessness. She gets really, really mad and fiery, and then falls into tears. And based on what Dr. Sue Johnson shares about both of these individuals, it seems like Kyoko probably, based on the way she grew up, she has an anxious attachment, where Charlie has an avoidant attachment. And this is the typical picture in a heterosexual relationship. The men tend to have more avoidant attachments, just the way that a lot of men are raised in America. And the women, anxious attachment because of the nurturer component. And that probably plays out in some way in a same-sex relationship. But y'all can tell me and email me, you know, those of you that are in those relationships. So what they need to do, because they fall into a demon dialogue, they fall into the protest polka, you know, where Kyoko is pursuing and she's angry, and then Charlie, he's avoidant, so he steps away and becomes detached. And they're falling into this protest polka. And what Dr. Johnson leads them to is what is called a hold me tight conversation. And the hold me tight conversation, it begins with a question, and you start with the person that is the most resistant to the conversation, right? Generally in a relationship, one person is distancing. So it starts with Charlie in this case. And the question is, what do I fear most? What's really going on beneath the surface? And the way you do this is you go and you look at what is called a rocky moment, like the last time you had like a really difficult moment in the relationship, and you talk that through. And as you're talking it through, and he's exploring that moment that they had, and a word keeps coming to mind for him. And this is the thing. You pay attention to kind of the word that stands out the most. And for him, it's just the word shattered. And the word shattered is what we call a handle. And a handle, in terms of this type of therapy, are descriptive images that open the door into your emotional reality. All right, so you got to pay attention as you're talking through. Last time that we had this conflict, and I felt this way, and I was thinking that, and you know, he just felt like when Kyoko gets mad, that he's going to fall apart, that he'll be shattered if he allows that in, so he becomes detached, you know, And we tend to think, we talked about this last week, that, you know, our conflicts are all here at the head level. The who did what, why, when, you know, that sort of thing. And that's especially those of us who want to get the whiteboard out. We're definitely at the head level, and we want to talk about facts, not feelings. But attachment theory says, you know what? Actually, the reason that you get nowhere in your conflicts is because you're staying at the head level, and the conflict really is down deep at the heart level. And we're all asking the same basic question: am I secure? Am I secure? Am I secure in this relationship? Jesus, he uses a handle in one of his most sensitive moments in his life. In Matthew chapter 26, Jesus, he's in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he knows he's going to be arrested soon, and he knows that he's going to go to the cross, and he just has an idea of everything that might happen to him. And so he prays, he says, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup of suffering be taken away from me." It's a cup, is the handle. And this term, cup of suffering, is actually a term that he has used several other places in his ministry, and it's a term that is used by the prophet Isaiah and the prophet Jeremiah, and it helps him get to the emotional level, the gravity of what's going on. Back in, I think it was 2003, when my father woke up in the morning, thought he had kidney stones. By the end of the day, he was diagnosed with stage 4 kidney cancer. And we were told that he had 6 months to live. This prayer came to mind. And I think this is probably bad taste, but it seemed right at the time. I got Dad a cup. I wrote, you know, "Let this cup of suffering be taken away from me," but Dad understood where I was coming from. We were putting our faith in God's hands at that moment. Thankfully, Dad was able to live another 10 years. But we look for these handles. And so Charlie's handle, it was this idea of being shattered. And as he began to explore that, and I'm not recounting all the ins and outs of the therapy, it's complex, but just trying to give you the big idea. As he begins to explore what's really going on for him, Charlie, a man who's used to being in control, he realizes that what he fears most is his loss of control will result in the loss of his wife. That if he meets her at her emotional level and is able to mirror her feelings and to resonate with them, what he's really afraid of is that he'll lose control of himself and lose her. Now, sometimes when somebody becomes this vulnerable, their partner does not handle it well. And sometimes they don't really believe the partner, or they make fun of the partner. There's all sorts of ways that this can go wrong. And that partner, right, Charlie in this moment is being incredibly vulnerable. And I just had to say, and this is what Dr. Johnson says, one only risks rejection when they long for connection. And so if your partner is ever trying to be that sensitive with you, even if it's difficult to receive, the only reason that they are being that vulnerable and risking your rejection is because they long for connection. Believe them. Believe them in the moment. And thankfully, Kyoko, she believes Charlie. And then it's up for her to go next. What does she fear most? And she begins to just talk about that Charlie's not there in her greatest time of need and that she doesn't feel cared for and everything. And Charlie, total guy in this scenario, is like, but you should feel good because we're here in therapy and we're working on it. He's like not trying to get there with her. And it's just totally the wrong move. He's minimizing her feelings, trying to fix it in the moment. I've never done that in an conversation, but, I've heard it's been done. And, and so Charlie actually does something really smart. He pauses and he says, hold on, I'm sorry. I will try to learn about your hurt. What was the worst moment, the worst feeling for you? And Kyoko begins to share that. The Apostle Paul, he writes many amazing documents. One of them is Philippians. And in Philippians, he says, in humility, value others above yourself, not looking to your own interests, but each to the interests of the others. In that moment, Charlie was able to pause and go, he was trying to fix the situation and make himself comfortable. Instead, he was able to stop and go, no, tell me more about you. Let me understand your hurt. Let me resonate with you. And Kyoko, she's sad, and Charlie, he says that he's sad to hear that she feels like in her weakest moments, that instead of being there with her, that he's going to lecture her and abandon her. And he's finally able to hear that and understand that. And he's sad. And Dr. Johnson says his emotional presence is as tangible as the chair he sits on. He's not just telling her that he feels sad, but you can see it, you can feel it. The goal is to resonate with your mate. That's what we're looking for. At a theological level and a psychological level, but at a biological level as well. We learn from the scientists and the ice cream and the monkey that this is a true reality. God created us to resonate with one another. You are created for this connection at all these levels. So once you're able to talk about what you fear most and be vulnerable with one another, the next step is to ask the question, what do I need the most? In light of my fears, what do I need the most? And remember, your heart fears rejection, but it longs for connection. That's what we're aiming for with all of this. And so Charlie says, I need to know you want me, even when you're upset, even when I make mistakes and hurt your feelings. That's what I need most. And Kyoko, she's, surprised by the vulnerability of her husband, and she's able to tell him that, she's with him even in those hard times. And next up is Kyoko, and she needs to describe what she needs most. And she says, I want you to accept that I'm just more emotional than you and that my emotions are not a flaw. It doesn't mean something's wrong with me. And I want you to show care to me when I'm not strong. In those moments where I'm getting angry or tearful and having those strong reactions, I really feel weak, and I want you to be close to me. I don't need you to fix me. I just need you to be with me. By knowing and trusting their own emotions, this is the part where they seek out the handles to try to understand what's there. And reaching past their fears, they're stronger individually and together. Charlie's able to show his greatest fear and be accepted by his wife. Kyoko's able to show her greatest fear and be accepted by her husband. Isn't this what we want? At my weakest, at my worst, I want to know that we're still connected. You still love me. And it makes you stronger to share that as an individual. We think that it might make us weaker, but it makes you stronger as an individual. It makes you stronger as a couple. And when couples can do this, they can more easily repair conflicts. You'll still have conflicts, but you can easily repair them and shape a nurturing, loving connection. Isn't that beautiful? And there's a way, right? There's predictable patterns that destroy your relationship, and there is a predictable pathway, these hold me tight conversations where we deal with our fundamental needs, our fears, and our need for longing. And to create a safe space where you can have that conversation with your spouse, have that conversation with your good friend, have that conversation with your child. And oftentimes, Dr. Johnson says that the other person is surprised that their friend, their spouse, wants that connection, feels that way. And you're like, he should have read my mind, you know? She should have known. But when conflict happens, we get clouded by the pain and we miss it. There's 2 applications for today. Application 1 is resonate with your mate with a hold me tight conversation. If you're both willing, and probably one partner's more reluctant than the other, but if you're both willing, you can get into this conversation. It's a good practice, and you create your emotional bond by revisiting a rocky moment, a time where you had a conflict, you had an issue. And you're not trying to figure out who's the bad guy. You know better than that. But you're coming together to say, you know, I know you fear something. I want to hear about it. Tell me about it. And here's what I fear. I want to be vulnerable with you. I want to share how I really feel. And tell me what you need, because I want to give you what you need. I know I don't act that way sometimes. And I want to tell you what I need. I trust you. I trust you. And it creates an emotional bond. And the more you do this, the more bonded you get, the more able you are to deal with the conflicts and the mishaps that happen in relationships. It's not just your relationship. It's all of us. It's all of us. We want to resonate with our mate. Now, the ideal is that we would both be wanting to come together all the time. But the real is that sometimes one partner wants to come together and the other partner really doesn't. And depending on how you were raised and the attachment issues that you bring into the relationship, which all can be healed. We've been talking about this, is a hopeful series, right? It's talking about the reality, but it's also saying, hey, look, there's healing to be had. There's growth to be had. But sometimes, you know, the other partner, for whatever reason, is just not able to engage in that conversation. So what do you do? What do you do in those moments? And so I want to just take you to a story from the Master, from Lord Jesus, who shows us what to do when those people we depend on the most, you just can't depend on them in that moment. And so this is going back to Matthew chapter 8. Jesus took Peter and Zebedee's 2 sons, James and John, and he became anguished and distressed. He's at the Garden of Gethsemane. He's had the Last Supper with his disciples. He's predicted that he's going to be arrested and that he's going to be tortured and crucified 3 times now, and that he'll be resurrected from the dead. But here comes the moment, the big moment. And, you know, you all have, maybe you haven't had this moment. You've had those moments, you know, where you're facing something you know is really going to be hard. And so you need support. He says to his friends, Peter and James and John, my soul is crushed with grief to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me. I just need you to be with me. You know, and sometimes like the problem can't be fixed. You just need people to be with you. He says, Father, if it is possible, let this cup of suffering be taken away from me. And then I think that he almost whispers the next part. He says, yet I want your will to be done, not mine. I don't want to face this. If it is possible, I don't want to go to the cross. I don't want to suffer in that way. I don't want to die in that way. I don't want to face this. But I want your will, not mine. Not mine. Then he returned to the disciples and found them doing what? Asleep. Asleep. Couldn't you watch with me even 1 hour? Keep watch and pray. And Jesus goes back to pray a second time. He says, Father, and this is slightly different, if this cup cannot be taken away unless I drink it, your will be done. I'm just going to double down on I want your will. I trust you. You're a good God, and I know that sometimes I got to go through difficult things. There is no promise that a good God will keep us from suffering in this world. In fact, the biblical story says that suffering is part of being alive because we live in a broken world. But that doesn't mean that God is not good and that ultimately God is there for you. You are secure with your Heavenly Father. And when he returned to them again, he found them sleeping, for they couldn't keep their eyes open. And you know, I've been so judgy of the disciples in this scene. I'm like, come on, you guys. You've been with Jesus for 3 years. How can you not be with him in this critical moment? But I just leaned into those words. They couldn't. And sometimes in our relationships, for whatever it is, you just can't engage in that vulnerability that is required in the hold me tight conversation. Sometimes your friend, your spouse just can't do it. And so he went and prayed a third time, saying the same things again. We don't know what the prayer was. I think that he probably shortens it even more and just says, I trust you. I trust you. And if you're ever going through a really difficult time, the words won't come, I encourage you just to pray that prayer. I've prayed it many times in my life. I trust you. I don't even have words for what I'm going through. And if I just start speaking, I'm going to get angry and all these things. I'm just going to make it really, really simple. I don't know. I don't see how I get out of this, but I trust you. I trust you. You see, Jesus sought connection with the Father when rejected by his followers. He didn't just stay there and stew and be angry at his followers. He just went back to the Lord time and time again. This is the pattern we're invited to as followers of Jesus Christ. When you get stuck in your relationship with that special someone, with that good friend, don't just sit there and stew and start pointing the finger. You got to stay out of that blame game. Just go back to the Father. I trust you. I don't know how. I'd like to resolve this conflict today. But maybe that's not your will. I trust you. I trust you. But then he came to the disciples and said, go ahead and sleep. Have your rest. I'm just going to accept you where you are. And soon he's arrested. And a crowd comes, and they got torches, and they got swords, and they got clubs, treating Jesus like he's a violent revolutionary. And one of his disciples, John, says that it's Peter, pulls out a sword, and he cuts off the ear of one of the guys who's coming to arrest him. And Jesus is like, stop this. This is not how it's going to be. And he says, don't you realize I could ask my Father for thousands of angels to protect us, and he would send them instantly? Look at the trust he has in the Father. He was at a low moment. You have low moments, but then he goes back time and time again. I trust you, God. I want your will. I would rather not do this, but I want your will. And when the moment comes, he has this radical trust that allows him not to forsake who he is and all of his values. Jesus' connection sustained him in the face of the rejection. His disciples all scattered. He's rejected. He's being arrested. And then in his greatest moment of agony, he's up on the cross. And Matthew tells us that one of the last things he says, not the last thing, but one of the last things that he says, he cries out, my God, why have you abandoned me? Greatest fear. Greatest fear. And Matthew says that he just cries out a second time before he dies. But Luke, he tells us what he says. The last words out of Jesus' mouth, Father, I entrust you with my spirit into your hands. I trust you. I'm afraid you abandoned me, but I trust you. I trust you. You see, your connection with the Father can sustain you when you are rejected by your partner. That's the good news today. I know this is kind of feels heavy. Maybe it's because I have sinus cold, or maybe it's just heavy. But we know this. And I believe in the good news. I believe in this hold me tight conversation. I believe that your heart is created for connection, and that your partner, no matter what's going on, what sort of demon dialogue you might be encased in, that their heart is good, and what they want is to know that they're secure and that they're loved. I believe that. The problem is not your partner, it's this pattern. And that if we can be vulnerable and courageous to risk loving one another, that makes a difference. But it's not a fairy tale. It doesn't always work out like we'd like it to. And right here, Jesus, he gives us what we should do when it's not working out. Don't fall into despair. Don't fall into the blame game. Go back to the Father over and over again. You will find strength that can help you in unbelievable circumstances. It can sustain you. So application 2 is, if you're rejected by your partner, turn to your Heavenly Father. Turn to your Heavenly Father. And you know what? In terms of Jesus' story, These disciples who reject him, who fall asleep in his greatest moment of need, then abandon him. Peter says he's never even known the man. I mean, they all reject him. None of them are there when he's resurrected, you know. They've all failed him, despite him coming to them open. But you know what happens? They eventually come around. Isn't that wonderful? I mean, don't stop reading. You know, at Gethsemane, they eventually come around. And they're able to open themselves to Jesus, and they become the leaders of the movement. And because they came around, because the love of God embodied in the person of Jesus, it wins in the end, came around. And I know that not every relationship here on earth comes around and fixes. I've been part of a failed marriage. Amen. But it is good news. It is a good news part of the story. The disciples come around, and if you just continue to love your partner in the best way you can, avoid the pitfalls, it's your best bet. And I believe that the strength of God can sustain you in the midst of the greatest troubles. Let us pray.